So the strongest version of neutrality is a version, or is the Austrian and Swiss version, which is based on international law and also on the constitution. So it has a strong domestic basis and a strong international basis, international law as well. It's not that easy to change this. So we have to convince your own population, and you have to convince the international community if you really want to change it. So international lawyers, they have various, especially lawyers who oppose neutrality, they're looking for all kinds of possibilities to get rid of neutrality. They come up with all kinds of suggestions, but it's not that easy. So in Austria you would need 2/3 of the parliament, but also you would have to convince the international community. We don't know whether you have to have a referendum in Vienna, but if you have to go back to these powers who signed the state treaty, because Austria adopted its neutrality independently in the parliament. But independent of this neutrality law, there was a state treaty where the victory powers signed it. So there's a debate whether Austria should ask them if they want to give up neutrality, but it's not that easy. So it's a very strong neutrality constitution plus international law. There is this neutrality, what usually common sense neutrality, but it's not a neutrality of the 19th century. So you're neutral only in the case of war. So that's basically you stay out of the war, but, which is important for any neutral countries. It's important also for the permanent neutrality. So I will explain a little bit what the permanent means. Come back to it. That's staying out of foreign wars is important for any neutral countries. Of course, you're entitled to defend yourself. So that's no question about that. But only staying out of war is occasional neutrality. Basically, just to mention, permanent means also being neutral in peace times. So permanent means not forever. Permanent means war and peace. So that's what permanent means. Self-declared neutrality we do have in several cases. So it's a decision by the domestic parliament. I think it's in Serbia, you have a parliamentary decision, or the government decided it, or you have it in a constitution which is easily to change, like Belarus had it in the constitution, they gave it up a couple of months ago, deleted it from the constitution. So this Moldovan neutrality is a self-declared neutrality. So that's more or less easy to change as well, like based on history, this type of neutrality. It's not as strong as this permanent neutrality. So, and then there are these more conceptual types of neutrality. This comes mainly from the Swiss debate. This integral neutrality, which is a comprehensive neutrality. So it would include not only military, but political, economic. So this debate in Switzerland said, the integral neutrality, we don't want to get involved in anything foreign conflicts. There was a debate after the First World War when the League of Nations, the questions, should Switzerland then participate in sanctions, for example, and then the Swiss gave it up for a while and say, okay, no, not the comprehensive neutrality, but the more differential neutrality. So differential means that military, yes, but economically maybe not. So this integral means kind of isolationism. So isolation, staying out of everything. So many, for example, in Austria, of course, that's not a clear-cut distinction. So you as political scientists, you know, they're always blurring lines, that's all overlapping. So in Austria, we have, for example, this right-wing debate the right-wing party, they support neutrality, but they have more this isolationist interpretation of neutrality. So I'll make a difference a little bit later. And the Swiss moved away from the integral neutrality, which does not really exist anymore as well. I skip. Yeah, and of course there is this. I should mention this. I forgot to mention this at the beginning, because they don't call it permanent neutrality. Turkmenistan has a very strong type of neutrality. It's also based on international law, but they don't call it permanent neutrality. They call it positive neutrality. So that's. Turkmenistan is the third country in the world which neutrality is based on. But this neutrality is more this type of integral neutrality. Turkmenistan is pretty much an isolationist neutrality. So that's and then of course we have the non-aligned movement, and there was already, of course, you know this from the times of Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia was a leading country in the non-aligned movement in the 70s, for example. But it's in a different version. It emerges again. Now we have this BRICS movement, for example, where there are many non-aligned countries there, and we speak about the global south. So they are trying to get more independent positions. So when it comes to the war in Ukraine, they don't support all the sanctions. Some support the sanctions partially. Most of them say, because they say it's important to save the territorial integrity and sovereignty, so they're against the invasion, against the Russian invasion, but that they don't go along with all the sanctions. So that's kind of new emergence of a global south, which is based on the idea of the non-aligned movement. Austria developed a concept under Bruno Kreisky when he was chancellor of active neutrality, saying, no, we're not this isolationist neutrality, we have to be active. And so he was, it depends of course very much also on his, depended very much on his personality. I guess also the Yugoslav non-alignment position depended very much on the personality of Tito at that time as well, very strong personalities. And Kreisky, he was the first, for example, which is relevant today again, as you can tell, he was the first statesman who brought the idea of the two-state solution in the Middle East before the United Nations. So he was active there, also negotiating with Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian movement, entity at that time, organization, the PLO. And he suggested, for example, a Marshall Plan for the Third World. The Marshall Plan was something that the Americans gave to the Europeans after the Second World War, and now Kreisky suggested we should give it to the Third World countries, called at that time Third World countries. He was the one who brought this, mainly the international organizations to Vienna. Of course, the IEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, already was in Vienna since '57, but because Austria was neutral. But that was the Austrian Center was created under Kreisky. That means active neutrality. So, but now we are not in the 70s anymore. And Austria, for example, now is part of the European defense and security and defense policy of the European Union. And Austria participates also, for example, in the Partnership for Peace program of NATO. And Austria, increasingly, to my mind, not enough in UN peacekeeping operations, EU peacekeeping operations. And Austria is what they claim, Austrians claim, and what is true. Neutrality is not a neutrality of values, so they could speak up if there is a genocide, if there is ethnic cleansing, if there is massive human rights violations, if there is war. So neutral states should not stay out but raise their voice. But at the same time, they should make suggestions. Otherwise, if you raise your voice and do not have any suggestion of mediation and being a host of meetings, it's just a confession. So that would be a confession neutrality, which is doesn't help at all. So when Kreisky suggested the two-state solution for the Middle East, so it was a suggestion, it was not implemented until today, but it was a suggestion. So what I'm saying is, Austria is now raising its voice, but from the current government, I shouldn't criticize my own country, but I'm a political scientist, I'm independent, I can do this. There's not much of suggestions coming out from the government. It's not, no real creative solutions. Neither for the Middle East nor for the Ukraine war. I come back to Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, a little bit later. I hope it's on the slides. I didn't look at the slides for a long time, but I come back anyway, I promise you. So, in a nutshell, the neutrality law in Austria, I should mention this historically to get the context. After 1945, Austria was occupied, like Germany, by the four powers. And when Austria adopted the neutrality law in 1955, October 26, all the soldiers would leave Austrian territory, and Austria would get its territorial integrity and sovereignty back. There was a danger that Austria would have been divided like Germany, so that was a real danger. And neutrality saved Austria's independence. And in a nutshell, it's a very good law, because it captures pretty much all what neutrality is about. So for me, the real red line for neutrality, being neutral and non-neutral, or aligned or non-aligned, is the membership of a military alliance. So that's if once you're part of the membership of a military alliance like NATO, you commit yourself to this so-called Article 5, the security guarantee, so you promise to come to the aid with military means to another country if that one country is attacked beforehand. A neutral state cannot give these promises beforehand. Of course, in times of war, you can, of course, make your decision if you act in self-defense or not, but if you just give a promise to come to the aid to another country, so that's the real red line. So Austria was not allowed to you see this in the second paragraph, to join any military alliance, but it was at the same time a neutral state is not allowed to deploy permanently foreign troops on its territory. Of course, there can be military attaches or visits, even exercises, but no bases there. The permanent neutrality gets a little more unclear, but I think it's what I said before. Permanent means you're already neutral in peace times. That means permanent. So you are not participating in foreign wars. So you can interpret this first paragraph. But at the same time, Austria promised armed neutrality. That's not necessary for all neutral states, but more or less Switzerland and all others. Costa Rica might be an exception. They do have a strong police force, but not so much. Armed neutrality means that Austria should defend its neutrality with all its means at its disposal. So it's a little open, but now international law interpreted it as like, okay, it's an armed neutrality, which is true, because when President Eisenhower of the US when Austria got its neutrality, would accept Austria's neutrality only if it is armed. Of course, the Americans guessed they could also rely on the neutral forces if there is an attack by the Warsaw Pact countries, that the Austrian forces would also be a barrier against these attacks. That what the Americans had in mind as well, but nevertheless. So this is more or less, I would say, in terms of international law, a pretty good summary of what neutrality should be about. I should mention this, which is important because it's under-researched. After 1955, there was, as I mentioned, Germany was divided, Austria was united. And then some pundits, experts, diplomats, they said, okay, what do we do about this divided Germany? After 10 years after the Second World War, Germany divided. So they looked at Austria and said, well, Austria got its unification on the basis of neutrality. So why not have the idea applied to Germany as well, but not only to Germany, but to the whole Central Europe. So they came up with this idea, let's have a neutral Central European zone. That was, for example, George Kennan. He was the former US ambassador in Moscow. And then there was a bipartisan American initiative from the Senate, Newland and Humphrey, the leader of the British Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell. So that all basically the same idea. Let's have a neutral zone in Central Europe, like Austria country, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Austria, and on top of that, Austria in the state treaty that I mentioned before was a little different from the neutrality law, committed itself to be a non-nuclear weapon state. So Austria is prohibited nuclear weapons, different to the neutral states like Sweden and Switzerland. They experimented with nuclear weapons until the 60s. So, but Austria was prohibited from the beginning. So then there came this Rapatsky plan on top of that. So Rapatsky was the Polish foreign minister, and he looked at Austria as well and said, okay, let's have this neutral, disengaged zone, what he called it, and combine it with the nuclear weapon-free zone, Central Europe. So that would be a huge Austrian model for Central Europe. It didn't work out because of the Cold War, because the German Chancellor Adenauer opposed it fiercely, this idea, because he was afraid that the West integration would be stopped on this, and he said it was a Soviet poison, which was not true, because neither Finland nor Austria became members of the Warsaw Pact. I have it on my slide here. Austria could have become a model for Ukraine as well. So that's a little bit my own failed contribution, because in March 3, 2014, I wrote an article for an Austrian paper where I write Ukraine should look at the neutrality model of Austria, March 3, 2014, in order to avoid a war and in order to avoid a permanent division like Germany. So, no international paper would publish that at that time, so it was not an issue. But I have to say, about 3 days later, not that he copied this from me, Henry Kissinger came out with basically the same idea. That was quoted in international papers, not that much, but a little bit. But he used the example of Finland and not Austria. So the Austrian foreign minister picked this up for a couple of months until October. March 3 was before the Russian invasion of Crimea, so that was March 20th. So the Austrian foreign minister picked it up, but dropped it immediately in October, I guess because of pressure of NATO, pressure of the East European countries, Ukraine, and pressure of the US, so they dropped it, everything. So that was my failed contribution to the suggestion. I still think it was a good idea because it never was really tested. There was a suggestion in March 2023 in Ukraine when you had the Istanbul negotiations. There was neutrality on the table again, but then, of course, it was blocked, especially by the British Prime Minister Johnson and the US, I guess, as well. So the idea was in the air. So it's not because of me, but the idea was somewhere in the air. I see I'm talking much too long. So going through a little bit to the history, I have to say first, the Institute of Neutrality is not a child of the Cold War, as many would suggest in Austria, because it happened that Austria's neutrality and Finnish neutrality was born into the Cold War. Doesn't mean that neutrality was born in that time. So neutrality goes back to at least 1815, but also before, when Switzerland and Belgium became neutral, and then the neutrality based on international law goes back to the Hague Convention, especially in 1907. So it is much older than the Cold War. Because many would say now, oh, the Cold War was over, why do we need neutrality anymore? Between what and what should you remain neutral? So which is a stupid thing to say, I have to say, so because looking a little bit on history, it's a little different. I would argue neutrality, and that is true for Yugoslavia, is non-alignment as well, is the exception of the Cold War. In the Cold War, as you know, you had these two military blocs. You had NATO, and the Warsaw Pact, and the leading powers, the US and the Soviet Union. And they were building blocks, especially in Europe. So more in the third world, where there were more contested areas, but it would go too far now to talk about this one. So the Cold War was about blocks. And neutrality and non-alignment was the attempt to stay out of blocks. So it was an anomaly. It was the exception of the Cold War neutrality. And already they played a very useful role at that time. So they could, because they were neutral, they played a very useful role in the CSE process, the Conference on Security and Cooperation. The idea was, because it was the height of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race and tensions were rising, but there was this concept of détente, but in this atmosphere, and you had important political figures as well in this détente process, like Kreisky, as I mentioned, Olof Palme of Sweden, and also Willy Brandt of Germany. The neutral and non-aligned came together, non-aligned because of Yugoslavia. So it was at that time mainly Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, Austria, and Yugoslavia, which would set up a process where these members of the blocs could get together and reduce the mutual threat. So that was the CEC process with the peak of the Helsinki summit in 1975. So of course, historians can discuss about this, but my idea is that the CEC process never would have happened without the mediating role of the states who stayed out of the bloc, and they could bring together these blocs in this conference. My idea is just, I just go a little bit beyond my presentation, but my idea is after the end of hopefully there will be an end soon, the war in Ukraine, we might need something like a CEC process again. After the war, so you will have blocs, you will have a divided Ukraine, basically. You will have to have a new Iron Curtain. So going right through Ukraine, like Germany or even Korea, you have this dividing line. Then you have to come together and set up something like the CEC process. It will not be Helsinki anymore, because Helsinki is then Finland is member of NATO. But then some states from the global south or other neutral states should trying to set up this new process. That's my idea. Good, Cold War. After the Cold War, this phase of American unipolarity, when the Cold War was dissolved, the Soviet Union disappeared, the Warsaw Pact was not there anymore. So there was this US hegemony, and the American political scientist Charles Krauthammer called it the unipolar moment. So no challenger there anymore. So Soviet Union was at that time, China was not strong enough at that time, Soviet Union disappeared, so unipolar moment. And there are political international relations, there is a theory of hegemonic peace. They say, okay, if we have an hegemon here, there will be no major wars anymore because there is no challenger. So that's the idea of this idea of hegemonic peace. But I have to say, this concept comes from the realist school. But not everything what the realist says is wrong. So there are many things they get right, but this idea basically is wrong, because just recently data sets from several US universities, they counted the US military interventions from 75 when the US became independent, more or less, and until 2022, they counted the military interventions, and the result was the majority of the interventions would fall in this period of unipolarity. So there were about 400 military interventions, and 25% of these military interventions would happen in this period of the unipolarity, in this 20-some years after the end of the Cold War. So no hegemonic peace here. So if hegemons can act as they want, they do as they want. So it was a bad time for neutral states, because if you're a hegemon, there's no room for neutrality. So and the example, of course, we had the war in Afghanistan, and it was the original, because of 9/11, of course, there was US that was Al-Qaeda plus the Taliban in Afghanistan. We have to punish the Taliban and start this war. but it was mainly Al-Qaeda, it was not so much Taliban, as I have to say. And then it was based, the original intervention, on this Article 5 NATO commitment, because the US we are attacked, and Article 5, NATO members have to come to our aid, so we have to start the war in Afghanistan, but it was based later on UN authorization, later on with some UN Security Council resolution. But during that time, the American ambassadors would show up in the foreign ministry and defense ministry of Austria and say, why don't you send more troops to Afghanistan? Austria was very hesitant, sending only a couple of liaison officers, 10, 15, at some point it was 70 because of the elections. And they was, we don't do it because we don't know what the result of this war be, we don't get involved in this. We have our peace troops in the Balkans anyway, Bosnia mainly, in Africa, in Lebanon, we don't have the capacities. So eventually it turned, of course, out that the Austrians were right. After 20 years, the Americans withdrew. The Germans were very surprised because the Americans ended the so-called nation building. The Austrians never participated in that. So Austrian intelligence was much better than the NATO intelligence, but I guess the NATO intelligence, they knew it as well, but they didn't say it. So, but Austria saved in this case neutrality because they a little bit easier could say no, we don't. So, like NATO states could not really resist at that time. Now we are moving on to a period of multipolarity. Some say multipolarity. I think it's a euphemism because the American security strategies would rather speak about great power competition. And I think that's more correct because when you use all the dimensions, including the military dimension, you do have only three big powers. It was US, China, Russia. Russia will lose its status after the war, I guess. Of course, there's a multipolarity in terms of economic strengths beneath this level, like European Union, Japan, Brazil, and the BRICS states. Even so, China and Russia are part of the BRICS states as well. But what we are seeing is now a new polarization, because now this more or less we see this China-US polarization, a new bipolarity. Of course, we have this bipolarity on a European level between the West and Russia as well. And when it comes to polarization, there's a new commitments for neutral states again, as we had it during the Cold War. So, I'm talking much too long. Polarization, I will be quick here. Maybe I'll skip this for the moment because it's not, a little bit, this has to do with neutrality as well. Polarization always comes with two features. One is alliance building. So we see this more and more again, in alliance building. We had, of course, alliances during the Cold War, polarization, Russia backed NATO. But now China, as I mentioned, is emerging as a new power. And we see that the US is building up alliances in the Pacific more and more, like the AUKUS, this new alliance. It's not as strong as NATO, of course, yet, between the US, Great Britain, and Australia. Then you have the Quad between Japan, India, US, Great Britain. And also, we had this meeting. South Korea wants to be part of the Quad, but as a replacement, they get this three-country. They met in Camp David 2 months ago. South Korea and Japan and the US as well. It's a kind of relationship. China doesn't have alliances in that much. The Shanghai Cooperation Initiative is not really an alliance. But China has these initiatives, these global initiatives, global development initiative, global security initiative, the Belt and Road initiative. China sees this as through a multilateral lens, but there are lots of bilateral relations, which is not really an alliance. It's more an economic, of course, also political network. Russia does not really have effective alliances. There's the CSTO, the follow-up organization of the Warsaw Pact, which is more or less was failing, and now we see in Armenia and Azerbaijan conflicts. They are not really. Russia has relations, bilateral relations, with countries in Africa, mainly on the basis of arms delivery. China is much stronger in Africa economically than Russia is. And it comes it comes polarization with ideology. The Americans digged up the old ideology what they had during the Cold War. They had market economies, state economies, democracies versus communism, so that was the idea. President Biden is coming up with the same idea, autocracies versus democracy. So it's mainly ideology, because Americans has good relations with autocratic states as well, as you know, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, whatever. China's Belt and Road initiative is somehow attractive, so it has some soft power. Russia doesn't really have a good ideology now anymore. Communism was somehow attractive for intellectuals and so forth. Russia, during the Ukraine war, there's no Peter the Great, Russification, it's not really attractive, and Nazification, so not a good ideology. So what we saw actually, I think that was the main reason why Russia invaded Ukraine, because from the west there was NATO expansion, there was this tendency that, it was more than a tendency, a policy already that Ukraine would join NATO. There was the next step would be first arming Ukraine and then becoming membership. So the Russians really didn't want Ukraine as a NATO member at the border. It was a perception. I don't know whether that was a real danger, but we can discuss this. But also in the east and south, China was much stronger than Russia. So in the East European states and Africa and Asia, Central Asia, China was an emerging power. So in order to stay in this great power competition, Russia, Putin, to my mind, was a very wrong decision, invaded Ukraine. To say, at least to have some room and maneuver in the West. Now he has NATO everywhere. Finland, Sweden, NATO troops are deployed permanently in the Baltic states and Poland. So it was a geopolitical wrong decision. So that was my idea. So in this time of polarization, small states have two options, more or less. Bandwagoning, join an alliance, what Finland and Sweden did. But at the same time, they commit themselves to the NATO Article 5. So if NATO is involved in a major war, these small states are involved in this war as well. They're entangled. So they get security promises on the one hand, but they have the commitments on the other hand as well. So these promises, that's why Finland is saying it joined NATO. But I think it would have been much safer staying non-aligned as a buffer state between NATO and Russia, but then they decided otherwise. Now they are a front state instead of a neutral state. And the second option, of course, is stay neutral, so not getting involved in foreign conflicts. And there is a survey, the European Council on Foreign Relations every 2 years makes a survey among European Union countries, and they would ask if there is a conflict between China and the US. They didn't even ask military conflict, they asked the conflict. Which side would you take? So very few is China, but 60 to 65% would say they would rather stay neutral. They don't want to be involved in a foreign war. So neutrality is an idea which is out there. And of course, if you look at the latest NATO documents, China would be already part of the Article 5 commitments when it comes to cyber wars, hybrid and cyber wars. So it has some rationality. Neutral states have to be credible and useful. Credibility means they cannot say neutral states cannot say, oh, actually we want to become a member of an alliance. We are neutral now, but sooner or later we will join an alliance. That's what Ukraine basically did. So there was this Bucharest summit of 2008, and ever since Ukraine had the aspirations to become a NATO member. So Ukraine was not neutral at all, because there was no credibility. So if you're credible, you always have to tell the international community, I don't want to join an alliance, I don't want to deploy foreign troops on my soil permanently, and I don't want to participate in foreign wars. And you have to tell this international community permanently, also in peacetime. Otherwise, international community would not recognize it. Of course, you have to be useful. So I mentioned the CSE process. You can be useful as a buffer state. Sweden and Finland were useful for NATO and for the Soviet Union and Russia as buffer states in between. I guess the Soviet Union and Russia felt very comfortable with this neutrality status. So, and you have to offer something as mediation, as host of summits. And there's one possibility, I promised at the beginning that I will come back to this also. Now, since Sweden and Finland are members of Sweden are going to be member of NATO, there are very few neutral states in the European Union left, Austria, Ireland, Malta, Cyprus, but Austria is a pretty relevant state compared. So Austria basically has the only relevant country in the European Union which has the same status as most of the non-aligned states in the global south, being non-aligned and nuclear weapon-free. Of course, some non-aligned states have nuclear weapons like Pakistan and India, but most of it. So it could be a good bridge to the south. Austria is not seizing this opportunity at all. So, for example, in the last resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, Austria was one of the few countries which voted against the resolution that there would be a humanitarian pause, and the resolution called it also a truce, didn't say ceasefire, but said it a truce, and the humanitarian pause for a pause for humanitarian purposes. So that's Austria was among the 14 countries who voted against it, together with Hungary, Croatia, and some Pacific states, Paraguay. So the opposite is happening, what I'm suggesting here, so being a bridge to the global south. The model would be, so I don't want to glorify the Yugoslav past, but at that time it was Yugoslavia who really played this role. So it was Yugoslavia which was the leading country in the non-aligned movement in the south, but also participating in the CSE process actively in Europe. So Yugoslavia was this link, which I think Austria could have played. It doesn't, but it would have the opportunity to do this. Maybe other countries are emerging. We don't have a Kreisky anymore. We don't have these personalities anymore who are courageous enough to do this. But anyway, structurally, that would be something. So I call this usefulness now engaged neutrality, what I mentioned before. You have to be engaged. Engaged as much as possible and staying out as much as necessary. So staying out means, for example, not being a member of an alliance. So I skip this. Maybe I should mention this. There's this argument. How long did I speak already?
It's okay. You still have time.
No, there are important points I still want to make. That because there's this argument, especially in Austria now, if you are neutral, who is going to protect you if you are attacked? So who is going to protect you? Only NATO is going to protect you. That's what the Finns and the Swedes thought. And with my students, I looked also at neutrality cases, and there's always this example, Belgium has been attacked, was neutral, has been attacked in the First World War, in the Second World War. No, we don't want to end up with Belgium. So I looked with my students at cases in the past where neutrality was violated. There is almost no case in history where neutral states have been attacked if the neutrality was credible and useful. So, except if there was a big war. Except there is during big wars, of course, the target are not the neutral states. The targets are the hostile alliances, what they perceive as, or the hostile states. So Germany violated Belgium's neutrality because they wanted to attack France, and not Belgium. Belgium was just in the way. So it's asking too much from neutral states to prevent a world war, right? So that's, of course, some neutral states survived, like Switzerland and Sweden, but it would be, so only in the case of big wars, neutralities were violated, and actually it was the violation of the Belgian neutrality in 1914 was the reason why Great Britain got involved in the First World War. It was not because France would have been attacked, because it was, of course, maybe Great Britain would have went to war anyway against Germany, but it was a violation of Belgian neutrality, and Belgium was pretty successfully neutral for 70 years, 70 years until the big World War. There was the attempt by Laos and Cambodia being neutral because of the Vietnam War. Of course, neither the Viet Cong nor the Americans respected the neutrality there. But except of big wars, neutrality is a good security guarantee. The exceptions we found is Hawaii in 1895, when the US swallowed it. Maybe more or less Mexico was neutral as well, not explicitly, but in practice. And the US invaded Mexico in 1847. Right? So that was a wrong perception. And when there was the Hungarian uprising in 56, the Soviets suspected the Austrians to host insurgencies there. And then President Eisenhower of the US said, if Austrian neutrality will be violated, it would be a case of the Third World War. So if neutrality is useful and respected and credible, credible and useful, it is respected by great power. So that's an important point, because it's hard for me to explain it in the political and even academic community, but that my students help me to research this, so how important you are here. So that's so we're coming to the point about what is the European Union. So European Union and neutrality are pretty much compatible. So they are not mutually exclusive. So if Austria is neutral, of course opponents of neutrality would say that's not compatible. Because of this Article 42.7 in the Lisbon Treaty, it has a similar commitment like the NATO Article 5. But neutral states have an exception. They can decide upon, on the basis of their constitution, whether they want to participate in this or not. So they can decide by themselves. So Austria, in 2015, when French President Hollande, there was a terrorist attack, called upon this article. It was, I think, a wrong decision, because the Lisbon Treaty has another article which would be, I think, much more appropriate, Article 225, which was for terrorist attacks, or is. But Austria said, okay, we take part, but we send more peacekeeping soldiers to Mali to free off French forces to fight terrorism. So, but it was the Austrian decision. The Germans decided similarly. They would send some airplanes as well. So European Union membership, the Swiss might have more difficulties than I do, and Austria does, but there is no real contradiction between European Union and neutrality. Even if we had the European Union, if there are European Union peace missions in Africa, states of neutral states would get a commander in order to show, okay, that's not a French mission, that's not a mission of a great power, that's a European Union mission. So it might be very useful in that case as well. But of course, there's this Article 43 in the Lisbon Treaty, the so-called Petersberg tasks. They are non-commitment tasks. So neutral states take part in peace operations, peacemaking, humanitarian tasks, arms control, all this kind of policy, which is part of the European Union defense policy or security defense policy. There is no problem that that neutral states can participate, except in this 42.7 commitment article. That would be NATO. That's the last slide, because NATO might be interested for you as well. I have more slides, but I want to have some time for discussion. Of course, Austria is part of the NATO Partnership for Peace, like other neutral states, even Switzerland. But NATO has three main tasks. One is collective defense. This is the Article 5 commitments. One is cooperative security. This is like common exercises, NATO, interoperability, all these things. And one is crisis management, to participate in missions, for example. Kosovo, for example, K for I for K for all this. You know this is better than I do. And neutral states have no problems to participate in these last two. The first is a no-go. The first is a no-go for neutral states. But now, ever since the war in Ukraine, NATO now covers all the three ties mainly with the first one. It's more or less all collective defense. And within the collective defense, they have to do other tasks. So the room of maneuver of members of the Partnership for Peace is getting smaller and smaller now, which is unfortunate. So that's why that's why especially Sweden, that okay, we want to participate fully in NATO operations. So that's another reason. So I guess I leave it there, that I don't do this. Helsinki had talked about it, and now I stop here. And I talked 1 hour more. Sorry for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an amazing lecture. So we have a couple of minutes more for some of you who don't have a lecture immediately now. So can we collect perhaps a couple of questions and would you like that way, or you want to answer immediately after? Okay. Okay. Yes, please. Yes. Yes, here it is.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, please. So.
I have two questions. So the first question is, what are your thoughts on the Serbian neutrality? And the second question is, since all interests now are shifted from Ukraine to the Middle East, and I heard that some of the resolutions from the United States that are that tend to go to Ukraine to be part of the Middle East. So all in all, what are your thoughts? What's going to happen to the Ukraine? Is immediately going to lose? It's my fault. But what is going to happen? Is it going to be divided between some states, or is it going to become a buffer state, or something else? Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I would have two questions. The first is, what you see is the main reason why neutrality is so strong is the identity in the Austrian society. And the second question, what do you think is that identity one of the factors which we can say that is the main difference between Austrian and Finland position and their decisions after the war?
Thank you. More questions? Yes, please.
I'd like to ask, did the Austrian political official stances on conflict in Ukraine negatively impact on Austrian neutrality in any way possible?
Do we have any more questions for the first round? Okay, thank you, maybe.
Yeah, well, thank you. All very good questions. I have to say that one principle, of course there are many, especially national lawyers, coming out with arguments saying, okay, this is not compatible with neutrality anymore. For example, Austria is member of the European Union. The European Union is sending arms to Ukraine. So Austria, as a neutral state, would be prohibited to send in arms to the conflict party. So that's based on the Hague Convention. Neutral states would not be allowed to send arms to the conflicting party. It would be allowed to let war party transfer weapons to the countries, but they should treat all warring parties equally. So Russia should be able to in that sense also use Austrian territory. So, and then there's the debate, can Austria participate in sanctions against Russia? This is a very old debate, and I know you have to see Serbia as well. So there can be either this good decision of neutral states, so there is not really a clear-cut answer for that. But as long as you stick to the principles, not membership of alliance, not permanently deployed troops, not participating actively in foreign wars, neutrality will not be derogated, so violated. But there are always blurring situations. No? That's why in Switzerland they had this debate between integral and differential neutrality. So governments can more or less decide themselves. So Switzerland now they have the debate as well whether they should, Swiss companies should be allowed to send arms to Ukraine, which now the government decided it's not allowed. So that's not allowed to do this. So Switzerland is in that case a little bit more strict. But there will be a referendum in Switzerland then to go back more to the integral version of neutrality, saying no participating in sanctions at all. But Austria participates in the sanctions when it comes to economic sanctions. I think you can discuss it politically, but it does not really derogate neutrality as such. You can that's a political decision, but there are cases which blur the lines. So much. I don't want to lecture Serbia about neutrality, and I don't know that much about it. But I think that's my now. So you can interpret it as you want. But the more Serbia would move to more credibility, to more usefulness, and to put it on constitutional and international law, the stronger it would be accepted. So Serbia could make its neutrality stronger. And as I said, even so, at some point Serbia might want to join the European Union. Of course, there are obstacles, you know this. We have Kosovo, with the sanctions in Ukraine. That's an interpretation of the European Union. But the more you move in this direction, stronger neutrality, the more credible it would be. So NATO membership would be excluded, of course, but neutrality would become more credible. So I think that would be a possibility, because at some point, if it easily can change the neutrality law, some powers might say, or put pressure on Serbia, for example, to give up neutrality, like they put pressure on Ukraine. They put pressure on Moldavia now to give up neutrality. The stronger neutrality is, the less the pressure would be effective. So that's what I can to say. Moldova is struggling now. The line of President Sandu, forget her first name, is neutrality plus EU membership, no NATO membership. These are the three principles. But it would be more stronger if they would be able to put neutrality on international law. But Moldavia, of course, there's this stretch which is more or less Russian occupied with Russian so-called peacekeepers, which makes it more difficult for Serbia as well, for Moldova as well. Of course, you have the difficulties here with Kosovo, so that's recognition of Kosovo and not recognition, which is another issue I don't want to get into. Your other questions were a little bit more general about Middle East and Ukraine. Could you be a little bit more specific? Has it something to do with neutrality, what you were asking?
My thoughts were, since the interests of the world are now shifted from Ukraine to the Middle East, maybe we want to not sending that much money and help.
Okay.
So what's going to happen?
Okay. There is this debate in terms of course, resources, especially in the American Congress, you have this debate. So now some of the Republicans would say, let's focus more on the Middle East and less Ukraine, because there are some strong minority voices in the Congress who do not really support more funding of Ukraine weaponry. They're more concerned about Middle East, but they mainly then blame Iran. They want to build up a new enemy in the Middle East, Iran. So they have Russia versus Iran, of course, different perceptions, different resources. So, of course, the West, there are some different opinions. What is more important now? It might be, I'm not really sure. I didn't really make an research myself whether the resources are that limited, but I think for a while the West really can go along with both. But if it comes to a major war in the Middle East, the West and the US might be very stretched, because of course there is in the US security strategies, there is this concept the US should be able to fight two major wars at the same time. But then you have China, you have to be prepared for the really big war, what they do. And then you have the Middle East, and then you have Russia and Ukraine. So that might be too much. At some point it will come to your question, where should the priority be? We are not there yet, but we are moving in that, I guess we're moving in that direction.
Yes, please. So you mentioned that the neutral state has task of being credible, which also goes to beyond. And then my question is...
Back, that's a little bit loud. Could you speak up again?
You know that neutral state has task of credibility, which also means to beyond. So my question is, what is the status of neutral state when it comes to arming? Does it have to take into consideration where it is produced and how much arming?
That's a very good question. Yeah. It's a very good question. It's always a question of proportionality. So armed neutrality, so the neutral state should be able to defend its territory, its neutrality, territorial integrity, sovereignty. That's the formula. Should be able, but it should not threaten anybody. And there is this very delicate line. So if neutral state is armed too much, it might threaten neighboring countries. It would lose the status of a buffer state, for example, and would create, you as political scientists, as security studies, you might know this, it create a new security dilemma. Security dilemma is you're trying to build up your capacities to defend yourself, and your neighboring state, okay, now that's too much, you're threatening us. And that's vice versa going on. The security dilemma is a very delicate balance between perceptions, capabilities, intentions. So neutral states have to find the line where at one point it is too much. So Austria was not only prohibited to have nuclear weapons, which would be, to my mind, a no-go for neutral states to have nuclear weapons, even so Sweden and Switzerland, as I mentioned, experimented with it. But Austria was also prohibited in the state treaty to have missiles at a certain range. But since the technology developed, this prohibition has been lifted at some point, and say now you can have missiles with longer range. But now there is this debate, there's always, always this delicate debate. Austria is participating in the so-called Sky Shield. So it should protect European states from incoming missiles, which I think it does not really violate neutrality, but it makes Austria already easier to a target, but because Austria would have to develop longer range missiles as well. So it's up to to the decision yet, how long this range of missiles would be. If there are too strong missiles, Austria's neutrality would lose credibility, as you said. So that's a technological but political difficult line to draw, but it's an important issue. How much is too much?
Thank you very much, Gärtner, for a wonderful lecture. You made a very strong case for neutrality, and I think the vast majority of Austrian citizens also subscribe to the importance.
The question of identity was there. I come back to this. We get together. Sorry for that. Yeah, go on.
But my question is, to what extent policy elites, people who are working within the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also experts in a more broad sense, also subscribe to the idea that Austria should remain neutral?
It's up in the air. Yeah. I link these two questions a little bit because Austrians are pretty stubborn, so they consider themselves as neutral, and no matter what. And so latest polls say, at least 75% of the Austrians would support neutrality if they are, after the 1999 NATO war in Kosovo, the neutrality support raised, because whenever NATO does something, neutrality is more supported. So that's and some say the Austrians are not well informed, and so that is only identity which can be changed. It can be changed. I come back to the elites, but my sense is Austria lost all the wars for 200 years. So there is this collective sense, why getting involved in another war, what we would lose anyway, and we would suffer anyway. So why should we would be drawn in foreign wars? I think that's not explicit, and most Austrians, if you ask them about the history, they wouldn't know. But there is this collective consciousness, what you learned it in school since the 18th century. We lost all the wars, so that's. I think it plays a role. I think it plays a role. Elites can change it. So we saw it in Finland, and because of this strong support by the Austrians, no politician really dares to touch neutrality. They don't support it very strongly either. So there is no major political party which would say, let's abandon neutrality, except the smaller party, the so-called neos. They won't immediately go to NATO. So that's. But they wouldn't support it very strongly either. That's what happened in Sweden for 10 years as well. And it is happening in other neutral states, to be prepared when it comes push to shove. We wanted to join NATO all along. So I would not exclude that would be possible if you really can make a strong case. If in the Austrian neighborhood there would be some major attack by Russians or something, or somewhere, which is far-fetched, or to my mind, is very far-fetched. So it's hard to look at the elites. Of course, government would be committed to the constitution, and they would not, even so some politicians do, they would not be allowed to speak up openly against neutrality, because they have been, how is it, vereidet, but they pledged to the Austrian constitution. But listening to the debates, elites, I would even say elites in the majority would rather join NATO at the moment, not publicly, but you're correct. If push comes to shove, they immediately would change, like Sweden. And in Finland, it happened within 2 months. So that, yeah, it's a good question. You can't really tell because they're not allowed to speak up openly. But my guess is the elites are more. There are only 2 options. The elites would say, oh, no, NATO. We want a part of the European security and defense policy, and they make the case that this Article 42.7 would be incompatible with neutrality. They would make the case for that. No, if we want really to be part of the European defense, we have to give up neutrality, but the next day would say we have to join NATO. So what happened? So there are only 2 choices, NATO or neutrality. The European Union membership of the European Union there is no problem, like Austria and other neutral states show. But they don't dare to say NATO, they say European Union, but mean NATO. So that's basically. Yeah, if neutrality gave up, if Austria gave up neutrality, so it would take 1 or 2 years, I guess, before Austria would join NATO. So that's.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Thank you also for participating.